They're still looking for Lauren at the office lounge.
I'm Mike Bridavsky, and I'm standing in the live room of my studio in Bloomington, Indiana. It's called Russian Recording, and I'm here to talk about this new series of Shure microphones that they just came out with. We recorded a live band today, and first I'd like to talk about my drum setup. I do an inside kick mic to pick up the attack of the kick drum, and for that I'm using their Nexodyne 2. It's a large diaphragm dynamic mic with a frequency response tailored to a kick drum. It's got a scoop in like the low mids around 400 to take out that sort of basketball-y sound that you can get inside of a kick drum. So I'm using that to pick up the attack. It also has a decent amount of low end. What I like to do is place a large diaphragm condenser center with the kick drum, not at the hole. In this setup, I'm using their KSM 40 large diaphragm condenser. It uses a 1-inch capsule. It's a single-sided diaphragm, which enhances the proximity boost, and that picks up all the low end that I'm going to ever need, and this mic does a really good job of capturing that. And then on the snare drum, this is an all-time favorite. I've been using my KSM 141s on snare for over a decade, and it's just a really great choice on snare drum. Excellent transient response. It withstands extreme SPL. Any drummer, no matter how loud, is not going to destroy that mic. It has a 15 dB pad and a 25 dB pad, very handy on close miking drums. So I'm using one on the top and the bottom. The KSM 141 has a polar pattern adjustment. It's a mechanical one that closes off the vents. So obviously on a snare drum, well, not obviously, you can do whatever you want, but I prefer to have a cardioid on my snare drum to get that hi-hat out of the damn thing. And then moving on to the toms and overheads, and this is where sort of my approach is unconventional, and I've over 25 years of recording drums, this is where I've settled as my ideal setup. It does not work for everyone, but if I know that I've got a really good drummer with a really nice kit that's tuned really well, and a drummer that hits consistently, this is sort of my ideal scenario. You may notice that I'm not using any tom mics close to the drum. I don't like close miking toms for a number of reasons. One, I don't like that snappy, overly accentuated attack. It doesn't sound very natural to me. We're not used to putting our ear right next to a tom and then hitting it. We typically hear toms from a distance, and it lets them resonate a bit. The other thing I don't like about tom mics, and it's probably the number one thing that I dislike about putting close tom mics, is that the cymbal bleed that you get in a tom mic is the worst sound ever, and it gets in the way, and then you have to waste a bunch of time gating it or cutting out everything in between the tom hits, and I'd rather not waste my time doing that. So what I do is sort of a modified version of the Glyn Johns technique, which is typically an overhead above the snare, and then another one that's off to the side of the floor tom, about 6 to 9 inches above it, pointing at the hi-hat, and then a kick drum mic. That's the Glyn Johns technique. Now what I've done is I've moved the mic that is typically above the snare, and I move it directly above the rack tom. And it also captures the cymbal, the crash cymbal, and the hi-hat nicely. Sometimes I have to ask the drummer to position things differently, but it works really nice, and it captures a really nice balance. And when I'm using our KSM 44s, it's a large diaphragm double-sided condenser with multiple pattern selection, cardioid, omni, and figure 8. I'm using them in cardioid. They're very smooth, so they do a great job of picking up the attack, just the right amount of attack of the tom, the right amount of tone and resonance, and the cymbals. It's a really nice balance. But to supplement the tom, sometimes you don't get enough of that oomph from the tom, so I add bottom mics. By themselves, they don't sound very interesting. They're like boom, 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 boom. But once you flip the polarity and blend them in with the overheads, they sound shockingly real. And every time I do this setup, people look at me funny, and then when they hear it, they are impressed, and I like to impress people. So for the bottom tom mics, I'm using the KSM 32 with a 3/4 inch embossed diaphragm. I guess they put a bunch of little dents into the microphone. What this does is it lowers the resonant frequency of the diaphragm, which allows for more even low end and really good off-axis rejection. As far as the close mics on the kit go, the last mic is this kit mic. And so I'm using the Shure 313, which is a ribbon microphone. It is bidirectional, figure 8. What's cool about these mics is they use this proprietary material called Roswellite for the ribbon, which is very lightweight, like a traditional aluminum ribbon, except it's extremely durable. And you can throw anything at it and it won't blink. It does an exceptional job of picking up sort of the meat of the kit, and it blends in really nicely with the other mics. I often like to compress it or do something like that. Sometimes I roll off the top end just to add some heft to the kit. A ribbon has a lot of meat to it, a lot of low end without that brittle high end that I don't want. And then the last part of my drum sound is usually a pair of room mics. I like to use a stereo pair. I often put mics on the floor in Omni to pick up sort of the excitement of the room. Oftentimes I'll also do a stereo pair. In this case, I'm using a pair of the KSM 44s in a Bloomline pair. A Bloomline pair is a coincident pair with the diaphragms immediately above each other, and they are pointing 90 degrees, and the mics are put into figure 8 polar pattern. The reason this is nice for a room sound is it's picking up a stereo image of the kit that's accurate from the front lobes, and the rear lobes pick up the ambience of the room, and so it does a really nice job of capturing ambience in addition to some of the direct drum set sound.
In Heather is smiling 'cause she's clocking out.
We had 2 guitars and a B3 organ going through a Leslie. For the organ, I used 3 mics. The high frequency stuff, sort of the mid-range, the meat of the sound, comes through this Leslie rotary speaker. And if you don't know the rotary speaker, there's a mid-range horn that spins around to create that sound that everyone knows and loves. And it's really fun to capture that in stereo. So what I did for this is I put up an MS pair, mid-side pair, using the KSM 40 as the mid mic. It's a cardioid only, uses a single-sided 1-inch diaphragm. And then for the side, I use the KSM 44 in figure 8. I use the high-pass filter so we don't pick up the rumble of the motor. And it did a fantastic job. Honestly, I was pretty blown away. MS is a cool technique as well because it's very mono compatible. When you mono the stereo image, it just cancels out the side mic and you just get the cardioid. So that's for sort of the top end of the organ in the mid-range. And then the low frequency of the organ is going through our Leslie rotary guitar cabinet. And for that, we use the Nexodyne 2 to pick up the low frequencies nicely. And it did a great job of that. On our Blackface Fender Bandmaster, that's what the Wurlitzer went through, and then later on the other song, the other guitar. I just use a single dynamic mic, the Shure Nexodyne 5. It's a multi-purpose instrument microphone, excellent phase response. I'm not typically a big fan of dynamic mics on guitar amps, believe it or not, but I was really blown away at how this mic sounded on a Wurlitzer, especially, which is, for me, a pretty difficult instrument to capture. It picked up the mid-range perfectly, which is what I really like to get out of the Whirly. The mic itself is pretty cool. It's got a unique shape that makes it easy to place. I guess you can also drape it over the cabinet, like some live sound people like to do. I typically like to put a little space between the mic and the speaker, so I'm about 6 inches on that guy. And then for the guitar, this is a pretty typical setup. I like to use a condenser, usually a large diaphragm condenser, and a ribbon mic together. That way I get sort of the body with the ribbon mic, or if it's a really bright guitar, it helps tame sort of the spikes. And then I like to use a condenser for clarity and sort of high frequency articulation. So for this, I use the KSM 32, 3/4 inch diaphragm, cardioid, and then the 313 ribbon microphone that we used on the drum set. The 313 has a really balanced mid and low mid sound that sounds great. What I like about it that's different from a lot of vintage ribbon mics is that the low frequencies don't get boomy, they're very balanced, and the top end rolls off nicely without sounding too dark or too dull. Here we are in the dead room of the studio. This is where I like to isolate the bass amp. It has a really good low end response in here. The bass amp is a classic Ampeg B15, just a fantastic sounding tube amp for bass. The mic that I'm using here is the KSM 40, large diaphragm condenser. I've got about 6 inches from the center of the cone. It picks up mid-range articulation and low end really well. And the proximity boost helps give it that heft that you want. And it's a very even low frequency response. All the notes came through really nicely.
The road goes on forever. Here comes Kathy's cloud.
So this was our vocal mic setup. We recorded 2 songs, and when we recorded the vocal overdub, David's lead singing part, on one song we used the KSM 44, and on the other song we used the KSM 32. This is the 32. The 44 has a little bit of a presence peak, a little boost in the top end that worked really well for the softer tune, added a little air to his vocal. And then on the other tune, the 32 worked really well. It's a little smoother on the top end and it's a little more meaty in the mid-range. But what I really like about this design, other than the mic and the way it sounds, it's very sturdy, it's very handsome, but this is the best part, this pop filter windscreen that comes with it. It has little magnets and just snaps on to the front. And it does a fantastic job of stopping plosives. In fact, David was in front of it and he tried to pee and he's like, is it gonna be okay to do a pee? Oh, I guess it's okay. And I was impressed because he was close, and even most pop filters won't handle that kind of abuse. I also like how small and dainty it is instead of this big, ugly, honking thing. And just the way the mic goes onto this is pretty neat. It's just really well machined, really well made. You just unscrew this. If you're doing close miking on drums, that can be clunky and get in the way. And then you just screw this guy on. And it's very handy. Very compact. And that's, to me, like things like that go a long way in the studio when you're trying to get business done. This won't break. Let me show you real quick. All right, well, thanks for joining me here at Russian Recording and checking this video out. This was an interesting experiment for me as well, because the studio is sort of known for our exotic vintage microphone collection, and that's what I usually use for sessions. And so putting this up, I thought it would be fun to listen. And I just remember, you know, we mic'd everything up and put up the faders, and I'm being totally genuine. I was pretty blown away. I can make a whole record with all these mics without hesitation. I think what makes them stand out to me is their really flat frequency response. And that's not to say that they're boring sounding, which you just heard. They're actually very flattering. The frequency response is balanced, but I think more importantly what I notice is that the phase response is balanced. Because when you combine all these mics is where you really hear what they sound like. How do they stack up? And they stack up beautifully. And I think a lot of that has to do with how they pick up off-axis frequencies. So that's usually where a mic falls apart, is when the sound enters from the side of the mic. And these are very phase coherent mics with really smooth off-axis response, which is especially important for drums. They're very easy to use. They are very easy to position. These things are really important to me as a working engineer, that I can count on these devices to work each time, and I can put them up quickly and I know what they're going to do. They're not going to surprise me. Really, if you've made a lot of records, you just want to do a good job of recording, and I can't recommend another modern mic that does it this well at any price point.